in my, I spent a lot of time in conservative world arguing with the self-described nationalists. One of the things I'm always at pains to explain to some of them is that nationalism is actually a pretty recent phenomenon in world history. I mean, there have been nations, Egypt is a very old nation, that kind of thing. But most of the nations on the list of nations that nation states that exist today, Israel's kind of in the meaty part of the bell curve in terms of their birthdays. And to your point, you don't get German nationalism is kind of an invention of of Herder and Fichte and those guys in the early 1800s who were, for them, the French, first the revolutionaries and then the Napoleonic armies, they were there Israelis. And It was oppositional culture that said, no, we're an actual nation here, get the hell off our lawn. And my problem with, and gets to the question, is my problem with the new nationalist types on the right, some of whom I think are very serious and smart people, and some of whom I think are just peddling a mess of pottage, is if you take them at their own terms, Ukraine's a nation, right? Ukraine is a nation. Israel's a nation. You can say the Palestinians are a nation. And yet, when you actually try to find a consistent through line about what American quote unquote nationalism requires, you get a hot mess, right? You get the pro-Putin people who think, well, Putin doesn't use stupid pronouns and transgender people, and he's a strong leader, so it's what his nation's interest is doing what his nation's interest is doing, and they don't give a rat's ass about Ukraine, which is a nation in much the same way because it sees itself as a nation. Right. And I guess the question is what do you make of this at a high concept level of the push to conceive of this alternative to sort of modern Reaganite, Buckleyite conservative movement, conservatism, and replace it with nationalism? Do you think there is a there? What part of the argument works for you and what part doesn't?
I think it's an interesting set of questions. At one level, Reagan always struck me as a pretty nationalist guy. And if you look around, look back at what he was criticized for by the left and his opponents, was that he was embracing a simplistic cowboy American vision, and he wasn't globalist enough in his thinking. He was, America has the right way, damn it, and we're going to follow it.
Right.
And also Reagan's suspicion and dislike of international organizations and sort of any authority that would try to limit the sovereignty of the United States was really pretty core to his thinking. So I think to try to say, okay, here's beautiful Reaganite conservatism over here, and here is evil nationalist Trumpianism over here, is to draw a line that's clearer than truth, as Dean Acheson put things.
And so I'll push back on that a little bit. Just I completely take your point and subscribe to it, that as a matter of foreign policy, there was a nationalist element to conservatism, rightly understood, and always has been. This idea that it's, that America has every right and obligation to protect its national interests on the world stage, and that we're, whether you want to call it the shining city on a hill vision as nationalist or patriotic, we can get into nomenclatural Jesuitical debates and all that stuff. But I agree with that. My bigger problem with, and I have all the skepticism about the UN and the globalist institutions, my objection as a matter of doctrine, as a matter of sort of dogma about nationalism, has more to do with domestic politics. And historically, I mean, I've been making this argument for a very long time, that historically nationalism within the confines of your own borders has a lot more in common with socialism than it has differences. And you nationalize an industry, you're socializing an industry. Socialized medicine is nationalized healthcare. And my problem with if you take the speeches of Fidel Castro and you replace socialist with nationalist and nationalist with socialist, the sentences don't change their basic meaning. And my problem with creating nationalism as an overriding construct, right? My argument about nationalism has always been it's like salt. Um, without salt, the dish has no flavor, right? This is a Roger Scruton kind of point. A little nationalism is a healthy and important thing because it creates a sense of social solidarity, shared history, shared destiny, shared interests, on the domestic front. A little too much salt, and you kind of ruin the meal, and way too much salt, it becomes basically toxic. And my problem with nationalism, when you elevate it above sort of Burkean conservatism, which is a series of sort of competing values, there's no limiting principle to it. And eventually what you get is a centralized government power that has to be the one true voice of the nation because it's the only institution that represents all of the nation. And that way lies all sorts of stuff about industrial policy and also creating domestic enemies who are, if you don't go along with the Volksgemeinschaft kind of stuff, then you are against the nation. And I just think as a rhetorical framing and a conceptual framing, it becomes really problematic in the domestic sphere.
Okay. I guess when I think about nationalism, I don't think about it very ideologically or even kind of as an ideology. And this may be partly because, I come from the South, and, my family, when I think about, what it was like to be a kid and what did I think it meant to be an American? I think I felt like I was an American the way a French person might think they were French. It's like, this is who I am. This is where my family is. This is the way people like us do things. And I couldn't sort of imagine really being anything else. And I remember even very young, I'd hear about institutions like the House Committee on Un-American Activities. And I thought to I just would instinctively think, well, wait a minute, if an American does it, it's an American activity. It could be a good activity, it could be a bad activity. But to try to have a category of activities which are all American and all good, and then another, is sort of is trying to turn identity into ideology, which doesn't make a lot of sense. As I grew older and actually came to live in the North, I realized that a lot of the people I knew experienced being American in a somewhat different way. And for them, in fact, people would say the essence of America is an idea. That is a sentence that would have made no sense to me at all as a kid. And in a way, intuitively does not make sense to me even today. Americans, certainly you study American history, you can see that different ideas have been prevalent. You can see that in America, to an extent, not 100%, but certainly much more than anywhere else, we've replaced not only do we have separation of church and state, we have separation of tribe and state. So that you can be an Irish American, a Jewish American, a redneck American, like a number of my relatives, and and all live under the same tent. But that's not an ideology. That's not a set of ideas. To me, in some ways, the Pledge of Allegiance, this sort of pledging your loyalty to the flag and the nation for which it stands, is what makes a person an American. And I don't see that as a bad thing. Obviously, being a Christian, I would have to say that, your loyalty to you have to understand that divine truth is always transcendent of any set of human truths, and that you may love your nation and think it has all these wonderful characteristics, but if you don't realize that God is better and that in comparison there's a lot of shortcomings in your nation, you're making a whole series of fundamental errors. So to make an idol, erect an idol of the nation, strikes me as very wrong. But it seems right and natural. And in fact, I look at American history, and I look at, again, with absolutely no illusions about all the bad things that Americans have done. Um, we're like every other country. We actually got to where we are on kind of a sea of blood, and a lot of
Mhm.
the things that we've done have been, well, bad. But here we are, like there's no other country that isn't in that a similar position. There's no virgin birth in history among nations. So it seems to me that if you're thinking about that, my problem with these people you're talking about who kind of fetishize the nation
Mhm.
is not that they're too nationalist, but that they haven't thought enough about what it means to be an American nationalist. And some
So I think
people
that's. Go ahead. I don't want to
some
cut you
people
off.
get very, want to make this a fight about words. Well, nationalism is bad, but patriotism is good. I think that's, I kind of think that's a waste of time. But
So I get it, but and I agree, and I've wasted a lot of time on some of these things, and I think that um the the thing is I've had this conversation with Rich Lowry a bunch, and he'll point out that patriotism um basically just means nationalism. If you go back to its roots, it's the fatherland, and patria, and father, and I get all that, but at some level of abstraction, you kind of need words to mean the word that people the concept that people associate with in these debates with patriotism versus the concept that people associate with nationalism are different concepts, and so it's at some level of abstraction it's worth having a define your terms kind of debate. I don't want to waste your time with that right here, but the
no,
only thing
first
I
of
would say
all,
to
you'll never get an agreement on those. Like, what does liberal mean? What does conservative mean?
fair, yeah.
Why even mess with it? Because you'll never actually resolve it. Then you'll hash it out with Rich Lowry, and then you'll come up
Yeah,
with somebody else, and you start from ground zero. Why?
no, that's
Why
fair,
invest a lot of energy in that?
because this is the life I have chosen.